Everyone, and welcome to Philosophy 307, Philosophy of Law. This is week 6, and I am Professor Jimmy. This week, our final week of Philosophy of Law, we are going to talk about my favorite unit, my favorite topic, which is secrecy and transparency in constitutional governance. This is something that gets a lot of lip service in contemporary politics and sort of the marketplace of ideas, so to speak. The idea that transparency is valuable for liberal democracy. But I'd like to argue that the situation is much more nuanced than that, and that when we think about transparency in constitutional governance, and just governance generally, it's not clear transparency is always best. Sometimes you need a balance of secrecy and transparency, and we're going to get into some of the less obvious cases for the sake of this class. But anyway, so transparency. So it's often assumed by people in liberal democracies that transparency is essential to liberal democracies. And there's some truth to this. You want transparency in um, the sorts of laws that are passed, the sorts of punishments exacted, in habeas corpus or due process, where the government presents charges, what you've done wrong, and evidence that you in fact have. These are all things in which transparency play a role. And one might even think that without transparency, a government, a democratic government, will lose a lot of its legitimacy. So voters, activist groups, special interests, lobbying firms, corporations and companies, these are all shareholders in a democracy, and these are folks who want to know that their interests are taken care of and protected within the lawmaking process. So one way of doing that is transparency. It's to watch legislators and lawmakers in action as they craft, shape, and pass laws that affect our lives. So the reason I'm emphasizing liberal democracy is because in a liberal democracy, there are certain features or certain things that are pretty standard, as opposed to, say, a communist or Nazi dictatorship would be like a contrast case, or a liberal, or excuse me, a religious oligarchy where you have religious clerics or priests or what have you at the top. Um, Kind of similar to Handmaid's Tale. So you can imagine a lot of different governing scenarios where transparency wouldn't really be expected. For example, communist Russia, even current Russia, Putin's Russia. But there's many such countries where transparency isn't expected. It's not the norm. But in liberal democracies like the Philippines or the United States or the UK or various places like that, you would expect um, citizens and voters to be able to observe the lawmaking process and ensure that when their elected officials debate and deliberate, that their interests are protected. This is something that the philosopher Jeremy Bentham is responsible for a lot of stuff in philosophy of law, and law in general. It turns out my wife had to read some Jeremy Bentham in law school, and Jeremy Bentham is a very peculiar philosopher. He's the father of the view known as utilitarianism. It's pretty popular. He was responsible for a lot of like British common law stuff around hearsay in courts, whether they can promote hearsay, um, jury trials and how they're structured. So Jeremy Bentham has had a huge influence on legal philosophy and philosophy of law, and even how laws are crafted. So for those who are watching rather than listening, the picture on slide 3 is of Jeremy Bentham, and you can see in the picture he's full-bodied and clothed. He's got his hat on. Uh, the body is actually his body. So Jeremy Bentham wanted to be preserved. So that's actually his body, clothed and mummified. It's behind glass, and people, I think it's in Germany, I think. I forget where it is, but people can go see it. You can go visit it and get your picture taken. And then the severed head on the bottom between his legs is actually his head. But for some reason, they couldn't attach it to the body. So the head attached to the body is made of wax. And it looks basically the way Jeremy Bentham looks. But anyway, I attached that because it's a weird little anecdote about his life. Uh, Jeremy Bentham was a very strange individual, to put it mildly, but he was also very influential, and he also held transparency in very high esteem. So, transparency, Jeremy Bentham thought, acted as a check on power, and this is a quote from him. Quote, without publicity, all other checks are fruitless. In comparison to publicity, what he means by publicity means transparency. All other checks are of small account. So what he means by that is if you have a check on government power, whether it's habeas corpus or a due process of law where you have to present warrants, you have to present publicly the charges if you're going to arrest somebody, what crimes they've broken, and then you have to present evidence in a court. All of that, and there's other checks too. For example, we have the legislative branch, and it's as known as Congress, that's the Senate and the House. We have the judicial branch, to and including the Supreme Court. These are all the courts, federal courts, the state courts. And then we have the administrative state or branch, the executive branch, the presidency. And these are all supposed to act as checks against each other so that no one branch is too powerful. At least in theory. You could argue in practice that's not quite what's going on or what's happened, but in any case. So the argument that Bentham is putting forward is something like, and I'm putting argument forms in this lecture in all of the slides, so you sort of get a sense of what I mean. That one, in liberal democracies, governments are only accountable if they have the informed consent of the people. Without transparency, there can be no informed consent. So premise three, transparency is essential to democratic legitimacy. So you can see that's basically the idea. It's because Jeremy Bentham thinks that in order to have a democracy, liberal democratic voters and citizens need to be informed as to what their governments are doing. So when they vote on them, when they cast votes, their votes will matter, meaning that they'll cast votes in a way that are informed and represent the interests of the people casting votes. So you really need to, he thinks, to be informed to really have a legitimate democratic government, meaning a government that does what's in the best interest of voters. And to do that, you really need transparency. So liberal democracies require accountability, and accountability requires transparency. That's basically the argument. And Bentham thinks transparency is the highest form of accountability. Without that, you don't really have anything else. If the government isn't transparent with you, how can you know that the other checks and balances are being followed? How can you know that there are other things keeping the government from going off the rails? So you really need to be able to watch and observe what governments do in order to keep an eye on them and make sure they're doing what they're supposed to do. They're doing what they were elected to do. And you see a corollary of this in authoritarian societies where they don't publish data that makes them look bad. This has been a long-standing problem with countries like China and Russia, to some extent, other places too, but North Korea is another one. But places where, as soon as they start doing badly, whether it's youth unemployment, GDP numbers, economic growth, industrial policy, etc., you find more authoritarian governments tend to cover that information up. It's just another way in which, according to liberal democracies or liberal Democrats, um, small L liberal, small d Democrat, meaning people who believe in a democracy where people can cast votes and have civic freedoms. So in a liberal democracy, that's very antithetical. We want voters and citizens to know what the government's doing, and voters need to know whether or not the government is doing what they were elected to do in the first place. So that's basically Bentham's one of his arguments for why transparency by government is really, really important and probably of utmost importance compared to anything else we can do. Um, so John Stuart Mill, who was a philosopher in England, so Bentham is, I think they're both British actually, around the same time, had a similar take. John Stuart Mill was an early feminist. He wrote a book called, or excuse me, it was an essay called "The Suppression of Women," I think is the title of it. Anyway, he was also very much in favor of liberty. He wrote a book called On Liberty. I'd highly recommend reading it. It defends a liberal democracy, a liberal society with things like free speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of religion. He was also one of the first feminists. I said that already, but he did a lot of things that we would consider progressive for the time. And he was also very pro-transparency, especially within democracies. So John Stuart Mill writes, "Unbounded publicity coupled with an ever-present newspaper press will give the representative assurance that his every act will be immediately known, discussed, and judged by his constituents, and that he is always either gaining or losing ground in their estimation." So John Stuart Mill would be blown away if he thinks newspapers, daily newspapers, keep an eye on politicians, representatives, etc. The representative, boy, he'd be blown away by the world we live in today, with phones and cameras and social media and instant news. But his point is that if you have a constant publicity as a politician, you're going to watch what you say and do and the kinds of laws you pass because you're going to be judged immediately by voters. They're either going to love it or hate it. This is what we do with polling. We poll politicians and sort of see how they're doing with voters. So, um, so John Stuart Mill's argument is basically in a liberal democracy, voters and citizens must have a means of keeping politicians accountable. Two, transparency allows voters and citizens to keep politicians accountable. In fact, you could argue something stronger, which is that what Bentham argues, which is transparency is really the only way that allows citizens and voters to keep politicians accountable. And so, premise three, liberal democracies require transparency. So these are arguments for why, if you find yourself in a liberal democracy, and liberal democracies, once again, are societies where citizens get to vote for their leadership, and they're liberal, meaning you have something like a presumption of innocence. The state has to prove you guilty of something before it can put you in jail, or punish you in some other way. You have due process, which means that you have to be presented with charges if you're arrested. You have to be explained the laws you broke and the manner you broke them, and the evidence for that has to be presented in front of a court or a judge. Things like warrants for searching property or persons or computers or devices. The government needs a justifiable reason, good evidence that some wrongdoing has taken place, and they have to specify the kind of wrongdoing that they'll be looking for when they get a warrant. This is in the United States, at least, but you find similar types of things in other liberal democracies, often not as strong. The United States is known for the Bill of Rights in particular. Um, Knock on wood. But you can see where John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham are coming from. They think you really need, in a democracy in particular, you really need transparency because you need to know what the government is doing such that it can adjust, such that when the government does, matches what voters want. And that voters, because of that transparency, can adjust their behavior in the next election if the politicians in charge don't do what they're supposed to do. It's a pretty straightforward argument. So what could possibly be wrong? Well, it turns out there's a couple things wrong with the argument. So it seems transparency is a pure democratic good, meaning more of it's better. So more transparency is better, right? And it turns out, as we're going to see, like there's reasons to think that too much transparency can be bad. Just as too little can be bad. It's sort of what you might call a Goldilocks problem. Um, so we're going to see how. So there's really two big problems here. The first one is that such arguments don't tell us how much transparency is good or desirable. So when John Stuart Mill or Jeremy Bentham talk about how we need transparency for accountability, okay, but how much transparency do we need? Do we need a do we need something like a staffer or a drone or some sort of a device that follows politicians around 24/7 with a camera so you record everything they say and do? It's not clear why that kind of transparency would really be good for a liberal democracy. It might be good for television. It might be good for snooping. It might be good if you just want to spy on a politician for some reason. But it's not clear why that would do anything to help the voters. So the question is how much transparency, where do we want it, when do we want it? And the arguments given by Bentham and Mill don't really address that. The second is that sometimes transparency can be antithetical to democracy. Depends on what we mean by transparency, outcomes versus process. So when we say transparency, do we mean the laws the government's passed should be parent, or the process by which they make the law should be transparent? And another thing to think about, and this is something that seems to be lost on a lot of people in this discussion, if transparency is so good, then why did the constitutional framers write the Constitution behind closed doors? This is something that, insofar as you think the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights are a good thing, it's an odd fact. If you don't think the U.S. Constitution or the Bill of Rights is a good thing, then you may not agree. This is some evidence that transparency is always good. But if you do think it was a good thing, and I happen to, I think the Bill of Rights as a document is pretty envious. Something that I think that's sort of the gold standard, or one of the gold standards legally. Um, so it doesn't really tell us. Um, so you say transparency is good. Why did the framers write the Constitution behind closed doors? But also, it doesn't really tell us how much and when transparency. Because drinking water is good for you, but too much water is not necessarily good for you. So, okay, so here are some problems with transparency. So, for those who are watching, this is a philosopher named Honora O'Neill. She's a British philosopher. She might still be with us. I don't know. She's getting up there, and she's been around for a long time. She's written a ton, but she's a political philosopher, and she explains why transparency can actually be antithetical to a liberal democracy. And this quote, I think, sums it up nicely. We're not going to read her in class, but she's got some good stuff on this if you want to look her up. She says, transparency can encourage people to be less honest, so increasing deception and reducing reasons for trust. Those who know that everything they say are right is to be made public may massage the truth. Demands for universal transparency are likely to encourage the evasions, hypocrisies, and half-truths that we usually refer to as political correctness, but which might be more forthrightly be called either self-censorship or deception. So what she's saying essentially is that transparency, especially when politicians know they're going to be transparent, they know everything they say and write is going to be absorbed by the public, they're not going to be honest. Imagine how you behave differently when you were growing up as a child and you knew your parents were watching, or another adult who was in charge of your care, grandparent, maybe an adopted parent, maybe a foster parent, someone at your church or school, someone in charge of you. Were you less honest or more honest when you were being watched or observed? Imagine how people change their behavior just when pointing a camera at them, and then they know they're going to be on television or on a very, very popular social media site. What about politicians when they're giving grand speeches that they know voters, activists, and special interest groups are going to observe and take into account? Is that the kind of transparency that makes for accountability, or is it the kind of transparency that encourages grandstanding? So here's her argument. Premise one, transparency incentivizes politicians to look good to voters for the simple reason that voters are the ones that decide whether or not they get reelected. And, the old saying, politicians only care about two things, getting elected and then getting reelected. So transparency incentivizes politicians to look good to voters. By the logic of democracies and how elections work, of course it's going to. Number two, looking good to voters makes politicians less honest and less effective. Looking good doesn't necessarily make you a better voter, or excuse me, a better politician, just as looking good doesn't necessarily make you a better kid or a better worker or employee. The boss is watching. You may look busy and actually be wasting the company's time and your time in order to look good. Not a good thing. Well, politicians are people. They have a lot of the same incentives to do the things that we do as human beings. So it wouldn't be surprising that transparency would have the same effect on politicians that it would on the rest of us. You at least pretend to work harder when the boss is watching. Well, in a sense, politicians are workers and voters are bosses. So transparency incentivizes politicians to look good to voters. Two, looking good to voters makes politicians less honest and less effective. So transparency incentivizes politicians to be less honest and less effective. This can't be good for a liberal democracy. Uh, Honora O'Neill's is pointing out that we care about our reputations, we care about what other people think about us, and we often don't show the complete truth. I mean, imagine relationships. If you've been in a romantic relationship before, it starts out less honest and becomes more honest as time goes on, typically. Not always, but typically. Because as the person accepts you and loves you and signals to you that they are committed to you regardless of your flaws, and maybe even because of them, this then encourages and can enable you to show more of yourself. This is a pretty common thing. It's human nature. And it's not clear why politicians would be any different when it comes to human nature. This is an insight from a political philosophy, a view in political philosophy and economics. It's called public choice theory. And it basically says that all of the same incentives that apply to people outside of politics apply to people inside of politics. They're tribal, they care about their reputation, they want to look good, they're trying to get ahead while cutting corners, etc., etc. What would you expect? Transparency is no different. It can encourage politicians to be less honest. But that's not all. Brian Kogelman, who is the author of our piece, and um, just as a disclaimer, Brian Kogelman sat on my dissertation committee when I was working my PhD. But anyway, he says, quote, this is from the reading. The basic idea is that too much transparency can lead to the agent to conform too closely to the principal, in other words, the person for whom the agent is acting, the principal's preconditions of how she should be doing her job, thus preventing the agent from doing her job in the most effective way she knows how. If, for example, if you hire a contractor to do some work in your home, then consistently looking over their shoulder may lead them to do a worse job because they will do what you think should be done and not what actually should be done. Quote. You get this a lot with um, doctors, lawyers, people who work with you or work for you. If politicians think that they're going to be punished by voters for doing a good job, they'll do a bad job. And too much transparency can get people invested in something in a way that they don't know what they're talking about. This is known as the illusion of expertise, the idea that people think they understand better than they really do. And I suspect part of this has to do with the fact that we are very, very social as humans. We rely on others um, for information. Most of what I believe about the world comes from testimony. I haven't actually seen a black hole. I don't know about the beginning of the universe. I've never seen Fort Knox full of gold. I wasn't there for the revolution, in the American Revolution. Like you're right. You can understand how like a lot of pretty much all of what I believe and most people believe is from other people. So we have access to others. We have access to others through our phones, through our voices. Now we have AI. So there's lots of ways in which we think we know more than we do, and that illusion of expertise can actually undercut experts. This happens with experts, and it can happen with politicians. We see this with voters all the time. So if you go to you take a political philosophy class with me, that's one of the things we talk about, which is that voters often have very economically and internationally backward views. So views having to do with like tariffs or protectionism that just economically don't work and that no economist would agree with. Some of these policies are antithetical to prosperity and they undermine the very aims of voters. So voters think the best way sometimes to protect industries is tariffs or protectionism or keeping people out, anti-immigrants. And there may be lots of legitimate reasons for doing those things, but the reasons aren't economic. So an economist who then ran for office would be forced to do things that they knew as an expert, as an economist, would backfire, would do exactly the opposite of what the voters claim they want. But voters won't listen sometimes. So that's the problem. And you get this in politics and you get it in lots of other places. You hire someone, like you go to the doctor to get diagnosed, but you reject their diagnosis because you've read on Google and you read at a site that that's not correct. And then it turns out you're just wrong and the doctor was right the whole time. So, I mean, this isn't to say experts can't be wrong or that expertise is always infallible or something like that. But it's a trade-off between, on the one hand, getting the experts to do what you want, but on the other hand, not forcing them to do something that just shouldn't be done and they know is just false and actually undermines what you're trying to accomplish. So if you hire a contract to do some work in your house, looking over their shoulder, they may end up doing worse work to placate you or to please you. When in reality, if you just left them alone or bothered them a lot less, or they were less transparent to you, you'd actually got better work out of them. So the argument form, premise one, democratic governance only works if agents, meaning voters and citizens, do not undermine their principles as politicians and officials. Too much transparency incentivizes agents to undercut their principles, so too much transparency undercuts democratic governance. So, so democratic governance only works under those conditions, only if agents of the voters allow the principals to do their job. So it's not clear why in this case more transparency would work if it were putting pressure on politicians and officials to do a worse job than they would otherwise do. That's actually antithetical to democratic governance. You want voter input, but you don't want voters running roughshod over good policy. In fact, this is one of the reasons we have the Bill of Rights. To use the phrase from James Madison, it's one of the founders. The Bill of Rights is designed in such a way to put the rights of minorities, quote, beyond the reach of majorities. Meaning Adams, one of our founders, was worried that a bunch of voters would get together and vote to take away rights, like freedom of speech or freedom of religion. And so the Bill of Rights and the amendment process was designed to make it very, very difficult for majorities of voters to take away rights from minority groups. But it's the same thing. You don't want voters overriding good policy because they think they know better and they don't. And if you take an ethics class from me or a political philosophy class with me, voters are woefully uninformed about most issues. There's reasons why that is. They have very poor incentives to become informed. But that then translates to poor policy. So you don't want too much transparency that emboldens voters to run roughshod over good policy, thereby undercutting their goals by voting in the first place. But there's one more thing to consider. Oh, and I should pause and say that, um, as is made clear in the readings and this and the other supplemental material, um, a lot of stuff applies more to process than outcome. So when a law passes, being transparent about what the law says is pretty good for democracy. But being transparent about the process under which the law was made, not so much. So this is actually the other problem. This comes from a book for those watching. It's on the screen. It's called Secret Government: The Pathologies of Publicity by Brian Kogelman. It's a pretty technical book. It's a philosophy book. It uses like political science and moral psychology and stuff, but I'd recommend it. But in any case, so Kogelman, because there's another reason too much transparency can be bad. It can compromise. It can decentivize compromise. So, so Kogelman writes, quote, "It is certainly true that citizens generally dislike it when those representing them change their positions. This incentivizes politicians to remain steadfast, which makes compromise difficult. Secrecy reduces this barrier to compromise, as it is now impossible to determine whether a politician has changed her views over the course of debate. With secrecy, the public only knows the outcome of the debate. See, process versus outcome. In the case of the convention, meaning the Constitutional Convention, the public only knew what the Constitution was ultimately decided on. Shrouded in opacity, politicians need not worry about altering their positions as the debate proceeds. This facilitates compromise." So, Kogelman's point here is that the reason that the process of writing the Constitution was secret, whereas the outcome of writing the Constitution wasn't, was because the founders understood that if you make the process transparent, it undercuts the ability of representatives and politicians to compromise, even where that compromise would help voters and citizens. But they weren't secret about the outcome. So this is a point that seems to be lost in some of the literature early on. So like Bentham and Mill don't really seem to distinguish between the debate and the procedure of producing a law and then the outcome of that procedure, like what the law actually is, and differentiating and realizing that transparency of one is good. So it's good to know what the outcome of a legislative session is or the Constitutional Convention. The outcome is good to know, and it's good for voters and citizens to know what the laws are and the Constitution says. But knowing about the process of getting there can actually undercut what voters want and need. So shrouded in opacity, politicians need not worry about altering their positions as the debate proceeds, and this facilitates compromise. So the argument form goes something like this. Too much transparency harms deliberation and compromise. Premise 2. Deliberation and compromise are key to liberal democratic governance. So 3. Too much transparency harms liberal democratic governments. So you can see how too much transparency, like I got the first point I made after we went over the Bentham and Mill arguments for transparency, which is they don't tell us how much transparency and under what conditions transparency is good. So it's one thing to argue we need some transparency in a liberal democracy. That seems right. And it seems right for some of the reasons that Mill and Bentham laid out. But it also seems like there can be too much transparency. So I'm curious what y'all think. Can there be too much transparency? Can there be too little transparency? And do you agree that transparency uh, can undercut compromise and undercut democratic governance? I'm curious about your thoughts.